We had just arrived home from a trip to New Zealand to find a client had pushed her kitchen into the following year. So instead of trying to fill the vacancy, I decided to just dive headfirst into building this coffee table. I had this Tasmanian ash veneer left over from a previous job and it had suffered some UV damage due to the way I'd stored it. I tried to sand it out but was unsuccessful, so I decided to just work around it. I started off by cutting the legs, just leaving them a fraction long for now, followed by a couple of thousand kerf cuts. I set the blade height to leave about 2mm left on the material, but due to using the wrong blade, the cut went a fraction deeper, which I'll explain a little more about later. After completing all the kerf cuts on just one leg, my forearms were absolutely screaming and I considered going home. I use a router to cut some circles. These will be the top and bottom inner structure for the legs, and this is what the kerf board will wrap around and be glued to. I'm doing a dry run here to test the length of the kerf boards. I mentioned earlier that I had cut these a fraction long, and that was so I could creep up on the fit. I didn't show this, but I cut one end of this piece on a 2 to 3 degree angle. That was to accommodate for the radius and to also ensure I was left with a nice tight seam. This was my first time using these Bessie strap clamps. I ordered these on Amazon specifically for this job, and they turned out to be perfect for the task. There's 3 legs in total, which means I need 6 top and bottoms. So once I was happy with the test fits, I just used one to trace out the other 4. I like to mark these out with a Sharpie as it's nice and visible, and with the thickness of the line you can basically cut to the back side of it, leaving just a tiny amount for the router to remove. And I thought I should point out that the material I'm using here is a melamine colourboard, not to be confused for the Tasmanian ash veneer, which again is just scrap I had left over from a job. I decided to cut these holes in the top and bottoms, and this was so I could gain access to the inside of the legs after the glue up. By cutting that bevel on one end of the veneer, it creates a gap on the back side of the join, meaning there wouldn't be much glue surface making contact. So by doing this, I was able to go back in afterwards and fill that gap by using a gap filling adhesive. Same process as before, I cut one access hole using the router and then use it as a template for doing the others. If you have a lot of circles or holes to cut, then doing it with a hand router can be quite messy and time consuming. You are removing quite a bit of material and it requires multiple passes, so I preferred this method. The way I've decided to assemble the legs requires me to be able to drop the kerf board onto the top and bottom, so by having a chamfer around it, it should help them to come together more easily. I'm running biscuits for alignment. Normally there'd be some type of internal structure for the join to sit flat on, but during the dry run the legs maintained their shape just fine and I wanted to see what I could get away with. And when I say that, I should probably point out that this coffee table is for us and not a client, so I was able to use it as a bit of an experiment. I went with polyurethane for this glue up as it's nice and thick so it won't run down into all those kerf cuts. I did however use a combination of polyurethane and PVA for the ends, making sure to keep the polyurethane on the back edge because I didn't want any squeeze out on the veneer as I found it can darken the join.
And it's not turned out the way that he thought it was going to go.
Yeah, poor guy.
A couple of weeks back, a band that we got to chat to, Polaris, with Nightmare. Just getting you ready, Ty. Getting you prepared.
The glue up went quite smooth. I think this was possibly easier than having a solid structure as I didn't have to worry about runoff, and with the top and bottom being loose I could just tap them around until they sat flush. Veneer on an MDF substrate isn't the most durable product to act as a table leg, so I needed to add something to the bottom to protect the veneer from ever catching and ripping off if ever this table was to be moved around. This design, however, is very minimal and I didn't want it to stand out, so I opted with running thin strips of solid mesmate down to about 4.5mm thick to be glued on. I just had to select a piece that was light enough to match with the ash. To keep a continuation of the grain, I'm gluing these bases up into hexagons. And by doing this, it also hides the end grain as it wouldn't have blended in with the veneer. I'm testing these on a template I made prior to starting the build. With this template, I was able to determine the diameter of the legs and the spaces between them. I even took this home and sat it on our existing coffee table to see how it worked with the space. Pinch dogs were the perfect clamp for this glue up and it really couldn't have been any easier. I did have to be careful though, as these pieces are so thin that if I were to hammer them too deep I ran the risk of splitting the timber, which did happen on one piece, but luckily I had cut some spares. I didn't have to be super accurate when making all these angled cuts because I knew I could come back and finesse that final piece if I needed. Being that there isn't much glue surface or any type of joinery for that matter to add strength to these joins, even after a few hours they would be a bit too fragile to work with, so I felt it was best to leave them overnight to fully cure.
Why you a wet dog? Why you all wet? You been out there, have ya? Hey? You a wet dog. It's okay, you're a good boy.
The financial impacts of COVID and the emotional impacts and many factors, I think.
Now that the glue is fully cured and we're ready to work with them, a little cleanup was required to get these ready for the next step. PVA won't adhere to laminate, so again I opted for a combination with both polyurethane and PVA just around the border. I did some prep work earlier by using sandpaper to scuff the laminate, as the coating on the surface is generally what prevents the adhesives from bonding to it. I tacked them in position using a staple gun just to prevent any movement when clamping pressure is applied. I did remove these later. The table will be sitting on a rug, but for whatever reason it decides to wander off, I wouldn't want them to scratch the floorboards. Whenever I have to use a router with a flush cutter, I like to remove the bulk of the waste. You get less vibration this way, so you end up with a better finish, and it also prevents the router bit from overheating. To blend these bases in with the sides, I ran the chamfer all the way up so it's just kissing the veneer. I did this in 2 passes, with the final pass taking off the tiniest amount. This helps to eliminate any burning, which can be difficult to remove afterwards without affecting the profile. I mentioned earlier that the blade I used to do the kerf cuts was probably not the best choice. I used a triple chip blade, which is primarily used for melamine and aluminium. The centre of the blade cuts 0.4mm deeper than the outside edges, which I didn't account for, and that meant the material left on was less than I'd planned. This led to all the kerf cut lines telegraphing through on the front of the veneer. I did my best to sand them out, which did help, but once finish was applied, they were still noticeable. With the legs out the way, it was time to move on to the bench top. I'm using this packer sheet to build up the thickness of the top, as the veneer board I have is only 19mm. Basically, all the material I used on this project was the scrap I had left over or lying around, a lot of which wasn't really usable for any client work I had coming up. You might be wondering why I pre-finished the legs before making the tops. As I said in the beginning, I dove headfirst into this build without doing any planning, and when you're also filming your very first video, it definitely led to me making some silly decisions.
Sorting as a safety precaution, the Weather Bureau puts an extra wedge of 45 kilometres an hour at the airport this afternoon. Passengers are advised. Michelle Rimmer explains.
After watching this video back, I'm noticing there's quite a bit of repetition in terms of the techniques being used. I imagine that makes for a bit of a boring video, but in saying that, it's not an overly difficult build for any DIYers or beginners who might be looking at having a crack at a kerf project. I'm using the template on my workbench as a guide to position the legs to the top, and I make sure all the glue joints are facing in towards the center so as they can't be seen, and I was able to hide the UV damage in the process. So here I'm attaching the legs to the top, and this is where things get a bit stupid. Why didn't I just screw up through the access holes in the legs? Well, because those access holes weren't a part of the plan I had in my head, And this was the idea I had for fixing them together. I actually thought I was being really clever here, and in a situation where there wasn't any other way to fix them, it might have been. But this by far worked out to be the most annoying mistake I made, as it just makes everything from this point on so much more difficult than it needed to be. I know there might be some traditionalists not too happy about these screws being visible, but unless I'm in my downward dog pose during my morning yoga sessions, I don't think these will get noticed. If I had have attached the legs and the top the way I should have, then I would have used contact adhesive to fix these together. This is a compression bit, and the downcut portion of the blade is what will ensure we get a clean cut. It slices the fibres of the veneer down into the substrate instead of tearing them up and out. I want to edge band around the top with solid timber, and at this point I'm not even sure I was aware at how difficult I'd made this next step by having attached the legs and the top already. After machining some timber strips down to about 2.5mm thick, I ripped them down to 5mm wider than my finished size. This way, it gives us some tolerance to play with that we can flush off with the router afterwards, and by applying a heavy coat of PVA to the back of the edge banding, it was slippery enough that once the strap clamps were on, I was still able to slide it up and down as needed for an even overhang top and bottom.
Stayed in the high seas, babe. But yeah, the song itself got the official community some thumbs up from the Amy Winehouse Foundation for Skeptic.
Music coming up very soon from Bring Me the Horizon as well. But before then, I want to know, Opal 396.
I took a fair bit of care getting these straps in position so as they were overhanging the edging by about 5mm top and bottom. I did that thinking it might apply more pressure on the corners, as obviously you don't want an ugly glue join. However, these Bessie straps, whilst I really like them, they just don't have the clamping power required for this application. I rolled with it, although I did go to further lengths to try and reassure that this would come up seamless. Part of the problem was I couldn't actually see how well it was clamping up due to the glue squeeze out, so I was kind of hoping at this point, which isn't a good thing to do as a professional.
Seen every single angle of this show. You are in the crowd.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know, off stage.
This trimmer setup is an important detail. Flush trimming the top can be risky business when you've come this far, so by combining a flush trim bit with an adjustable bearing attachment, you really reduce the risk of the cutter accidentally touching the surface of the top. I set it up to leave about 0.5mm left on the edging, and that way the rest can be easily sanded off later. When working with thin veneer, sanding through it is also a risk. So rather than trying to sand off the entire width of the edging, I run a chamfer close to its final depth, and that way all I'm left with is the tiniest lip. Like I did with the bottom of the legs, I took this chamfer to meet the veneer. This hides the glue joint and gives that illusion of it all being one piece. A light hand sanding is all that's required to get this ready to receive some finish. Here I'm only going as high as 150 grit, which some might consider to be quite coarse, but with the oil I'm applying it's not necessary to go any higher. I do however think it's good practice to give a once quick go over in the direction of the grain. The finish I'm applying is a hard wax oil made by Fitties. I don't have any sponsors, but I love this product so much that I would consider reaching out. I am by no means an expert on finishing, as I generally leave that to the professionals. That being said, this product is so easy to apply and so forgiving that anybody could do it and you wouldn't know the difference. I'll leave you here with some final shots. I have some cool videos coming up, including an American oak kitchen island bench and some timber floating vanities, both for a high-end job I did. If that's something that interests you, then maybe you consider subscribing to the channel. Otherwise, thanks for watching.